Ambassador Viral Koss stepped off her shuttle and felt the cold metal floor of Way Station Terminus beneath her feet. And she told herself that everything would be fine, that this was just another diplomatic mission, that the humans were nothing special despite what the reports said about them. She had served the Scythian Collective for 40 years and had met hundreds of alien species during that time. And not one of them had ever truly surprised her because she was too smart and too experienced for surprises that humans would be no different. She told herself as she walked through the massive docking bay with her 12 armed guards following close behind her, her assistant. A nervous young Scythian named Torek hurried to keep up with her long strides and kept checking his datapad with shaking hands. "Ambassador," he said in a worried voice, "I really think we should review the human psychological profiles one more time before we meet their representative." Viral made a dismissive sound with her throat flaps and kept walking without slowing down. "I have read every report about humans that exists in our databases," she said with confidence, "and I know everything I need to know about these strange creatures from the death world called Earth." She had indeed studied the humans very carefully over the past several months, and what she had learned was both fascinating and disturbing at the same time. Humans came from a planet where almost everything tried to kill them, where the weather could freeze them or burn them or drown them or blow them away, where the animals had claws and teeth and venom and horrible diseases, where even the smallest creatures could end a life without warning, and yet the humans had not only survived on this terrible world, but had actually thrived there and eventually reached out into the stars to meet their galactic neighbors. The reports said that humans were persistent beyond all reason and that they simply refused to give up no matter how bad things got for them. The reports said that humans formed emotional bonds with other species in ways that made no logical sense, and that they would risk their own lives to protect creatures that were not even related to them. The reports said that humans had a strange and troubling habit of looking at dangerous things and thinking, "I wonder if I can pet that," instead of running away like sensible beings. Would Doverell had dismissed most of these reports as exaggeration and legend because surely no species could really be that foolish and survive for very long. Today, she would learn how wrong she was. The Galactic Concordat had existed for over 10,000 years and had brought peace and order to countless worlds across the known galaxy. And Viral was proud to serve as one of its most respected ambassadors. The Concordat had many laws and rules that all member species were required to follow. But one law stood above all others in importance and severity. This was the Edict of Separation. And it dealt with creatures so dangerous that even speaking about them made most species uncomfortable. 3 apex predators had been classified as extinction-class organisms by the Concordat Scientific Council, and these 3 creatures were considered the most dangerous life forms ever discovered in the entire galaxy. The first were the Vexari, shadow wolves from the Death World, known as Nocturne 7, massive 6-legged hunters that could read minds and feed on the fear of their prey, creatures of living nightmare that existed partially outside of normal reality. The second were the Krethel, armored serpents whose venom could dissolve the very bonds that held matter together, monsters that could eat through starship hulls and melt through any defense that science could create. The third was the most terrible of all, a being known only as the Umbral Maw, a creature of living darkness that came from the spaces between dimensions, an entity that had consumed entire colonies and swallowed moons and left nothing but empty void in its wake. The Edict of Separation was clear and absolute about these 3 creatures. No species was allowed to approach them or study them or attempt to communicate with them under any circumstances. Any world where they appeared was to be immediately quarantined, and abandoned. Any ship that detected their presence was to flee at maximum speed and report the sighting to Concordat authorities. Many civilizations had tried to capture or weaponize these creatures over the millennia, And every single one of those civilizations had been destroyed completely, leaving behind only ruins and warnings for others to learn from. Viral had grown up hearing stories about the extinction class organisms, tales designed to frighten children into obedience and caution. And even now, as a grown adult, she felt a chill run through her body when she thought about them, but she pushed those thoughts aside as she approached Docking Bay 7, where the human representative was waiting for her. This meeting was important because humanity wanted to join the Galactic Concordat, and Viral had been sent to evaluate whether they were civilized enough and safe enough to be trusted with membership. She had already decided that she would offer them conditional membership with many restrictions and a long probationary period, because humans were clearly too reckless and emotional to be given full privileges right away. Her guards formed a protective circle around her as they reached the entrance to the bay. And Torek checked his scanner one final time. Suddenly his face went pale, and his hands began to tremble so badly that he almost dropped the device. "Ambassador," he whispered in a voice filled with terror, "there is something wrong with these readings." Viral frowned and grabbed the scanner from his shaking hands. And when she looked at the screen, her own blood turned to ice in her veins. 3 biosignatures were showing up inside the docking bay. Ahead of them, 3 signatures that matched the genetic profiles stored in the Concordat's most classified databases. 3 signatures that should not exist anywhere near a populated station. That is impossible. Viral breathed, her voice barely audible. The scanner showed 1 Vessery, 1 Crethale, and 1 Umbromaw, all present in the same location, all waiting just beyond the doors in front of her, and standing calmly among them, according to the life-size detector, was a single human. Viral wanted to run, every instinct in her body screaming at her to flee back to her ship and leave this cursed station behind forever. But she was an ambassador of the Concordat, and she had her duty and her pride to consider. She straightened her spine and lifted her head high and ordered her guards to open the doors. What she saw on the other side would haunt her dreams for the rest of her very long life. The doors slid open with a soft hiss, and Viral stepped forward into Docking Bay 7, with her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst out of her chest. The bay was enormous, filled with cargo containers and machinery, and the soft hum of life support systems. And at first glance, it appeared to be completely empty and quiet. But Viral knew better, because her scanner was still screaming warnings at her, and because she could feel something watching her from the shadows. Something ancient and hungry and patient. Her guards spread out around her with their weapons raised and their eyes scanning every dark corner of the massive space. And she could see their hands trembling and their breathing coming fast, and shallow fear hung in the air like a physical thing, thick and heavy and suffocating. And Viral realized with horror that this was not just ordinary fear, but something else. Entirely, something was feeding on their terror and growing stronger. With every passing moment, "Stand down," said a calm voice from somewhere ahead of them. "You are scaring them." Viral squinted into the shadows and saw a figure emerge from behind a tall stack of cargo containers, walking toward them with slow and relaxed steps as if nothing was wrong. It was a human male, she realized, probably middle-aged by their standards, with tired eyes and a scar running across his jaw and gray hair at his temples. He wore simple clothes with no armor and carried no weapons that she could see. And he moved with the easy confidence of someone who had absolutely nothing to fear. "I am Commander Elias Ward," he said with a small nod of his head, "and I will be serving as humanity's representative for these negotiations." Viral opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out, because at that exact moment the shadows behind Elias began to move. Something massive and dark separated itself from the darkness and padded forward on 6 powerful legs. And Viral felt her secondary heart stop beating completely. It was a Vexery, the legendary Shadow Wolf of Nocturne 7. And it was even more terrifying than the stories had described. The creature was the size of a ground transport vehicle with fur as black as the void between stars. And strange bioluminescent patterns rippled across. Its body like lightning trapped beneath its skin. Its head was wrong somehow, existing in more dimensions than Viral's eyes could properly perceive. And when it opened its mouth, she saw rows upon rows of teeth that seemed to go on forever into some impossible depth. This was a monster from the oldest nightmares of 1,000 species. A predator so perfect and so deadly that entire worlds had been abandoned rather than risk facing one. And it walked up to the human and sat down beside him like a trained pet waiting for praise. "This is Midnight," Elias said with a warm smile as he reached up and scratched behind the creature's ears. "She has been with me for about 12 years now." The Vexery made a sound deep in its chest that Viral realized with shock was a purr of contentment and pleasure. "I found her on Nocturne 7 when I was part of a survey mission," Elias continued in a conversational tone, as if he was discussing the weather. "Our whole pack had been killed by trophy hunters looking for exotic prizes to sell on the black market." He rubbed the creature's massive head with obvious affection, and the monster leaned into his touch like a cat, seeking warmth. She was just a pup back then, scared and alone and hungry, hiding in the wreckage of her family's den, Elias said, with a hint of sadness in his voice. "The other members of my team wanted to leave her behind or put her down because they said she was too dangerous to save." He smiled at the memory and shook his head slowly. "I told them that she was just a baby who had lost everyone she loved, and that being afraid was no reason to hurt her. So I sat down next to her den and waited." Viral could not believe what she was hearing, but she could not look away either. "It took 3 days before she came out to sniff my hand," Elias said, "and another week before she let me touch her. And by the end of the month she was sleeping next to me every night and following me everywhere I went. The creature that fed on fear, the monster that had haunted the nightmares of countless species, was rubbing its enormous head against the human side and making sounds of pure happiness. The Vexery are telepathic," Elias explained. "They can sense emotions, and they are especially sensitive to fear because that is how they hunt in the wild." He looked at Viral and her terrified guards with something that might have been pity. But what the Concordat never understood is that the Vexery do not just sense fear, he said. They sense all emotions, and they are especially drawn to love and kindness and compassion. He patted Midnight's head gently, and the creature's glowing patterns pulsed with warm colors. Midnight was not attacking those colonies because she was evil or hungry for destruction, Elias said. She was just a scared animal lashing out at creatures who kept trying to kill her and her family. Viral finally found her voice, although it came out as barely more than a whisper. "But the historical records," she said weakly. "The billions who died at the claws of the Vexery over the millennia were all deaths that happened because people shot first and asked questions never." Elias replied firmly. "The Vexery only ever attacked species that attacked them, and they only became more aggressive as more and more hunters came to wipe them out." He looked down at Midnight with genuine love in his eyes. "When I showed her kindness instead of violence, when I sat with her and let her feel that I meant no harm, she bonded with me immediately because that was all she ever wanted." Midnight raised her massive head and looked directly at Viral. And for a brief moment, the ambassador felt something touch her mind. It was not hostile or threatening, but curious and almost friendly, like a dog sniffing a stranger to see if they were nice. "She likes you," Elias said with a grin. "She says your fear smells like purple flowers and that you have a good heart underneath all that training." Viral did not know how to respond to that statement, so she said nothing at all. "Now," Elias said as he straightened up and brushed some dark fur off his clothes, "would you like to meet the others?" The ambassador felt fresh terror wash over her as she remembered. that the scanner had shown 3 extinction class signatures, others. She repeated in a hollow voice. Elias smiled and whistled. A short, sharp note from somewhere above. Then came the sound of scales sliding against metal, and Viral looked up to see something descending from the ventilation system. It was a Krethel. 40 meters of armored serpent with scales that shimmered like liquid metal and eyes that glowed with ancient intelligence. The creature that could dissolve reality itself was coming down to meet them. And Viral knew with absolute certainty that this day would change everything she thought she knew about the universe. The Krethel descended from the ceiling with fluid grace, its massive body coiling around support beams and pipes as it lowered itself toward the floor of the docking bay. Viral had seen images of these creatures in classified files, but nothing could have prepared her for the reality of seeing one in person. The serpent was beautiful in a terrifying way, with scales that shifted through every color of the spectrum like oil on water, and a head that was larger than Viral's entire body. Its eyes were ancient and deep, filled with an intelligence that felt older than the stars themselves. And when it looked at the ambassador, she felt as if it could see straight through to her. So one of her guards made a small whimpering sound and dropped his weapon with a clatter, and several others looked like they were about to run screaming from the bay, but none of them moved because their bodies had frozen completely and would not obey their desperate commands to flee. Easy there, Elias said in a soothing voice as he extended his hand toward the massive serpent. These are guests, not threats. The Krethel made a sound like wind chimes in a storm and lowered its head until it was level with the human's face. Then, to Viral's complete disbelief, the creature draped itself across Elias's shoulders like an enormous scarf and rested its head against his palm. This is Axiom, Elias said as he stroked the serpent's metallic scales with obvious care. He's probably the gentlest soul I've ever known. Gentle, Viral thought with hysteria bubbling up in her mind. He called the creature that could dissolve starship hulls with a single bite gentle. I found Axiom about 8 years ago at a research station in the Outer Rim. Elias continued as he scratched under the serpent's chin. Some corporation had captured him and was running experiments to figure out how his venom worked. His voice hardened with anger as he spoke the next words. They wanted to weaponize him, to turn his natural abilities into some kind of super acid for military use. So they kept him in a tiny cage and cut him open again and again to harvest his venom glands. Axiom made a soft keening sound and pressed closer to Elias as if seeking comfort from the memory. When I found him, he was covered in scars and barely alive, and his scales had lost all their color from years of pain and suffering. Elias looked at the serpent with deep affection and the creature's eyes, half closed in contentment. The scientists told me he was too dangerous to release and too valuable to destroy, so they were just going to keep experimenting on him until he died. He shook his head slowly with disgust clear on his face. I broke into his cage that night and I sat with him while he hissed and snapped at me because he thought I was just another person coming to hurt him. Viral found herself leaning forward despite her fear, caught up in the story against her will. It took 2 weeks before he stopped trying to bite me, Elias said, and another month before he would let me touch him without flinching. He smiled at the memory, and Axiom's scales pulsed with warm golden light. When the station security finally caught up with me, Axiom wrapped himself around me and refused to let anyone near us. And I realized that he had decided I was his family now. The serpent raised its head and looked at Viral with those impossibly deep eyes. And she felt something that might have been curiosity coming from the creature. The Krethel are not mindless monsters, Elias explained. They are actually incredibly intelligent and social creatures who form deep bonds with their family groups. He gestured toward the serpent with obvious pride. Their venom is a defense mechanism that evolved on a world where everything was trying to kill them. Just like so many things on Earth evolved to be dangerous for the same reason. Axiom flicked his tongue out and tasted the air near Viral. And she held her breath in terror. He says you smell like stress hormones and bad coffee. Elias translated with a laugh. But he also says you do not smell like cruelty or malice. So he is willing to give you a chance. Viral did not know whether to feel relieved or insulted. So she just stood there in stunned silence. Now, Elias said, as his expression became slightly more serious, there is one more friend I need to introduce you to. And I want you to try very hard to stay calm. Stay calm, Viral thought with mounting dread. As if she had been calm at any point during this insane encounter. But before she could say anything, the lights in the docking bay began to flicker, and the temperature dropped so quickly that Viral could see her breath forming clouds in the suddenly frigid air. And a pressure began building in her skull, like something vast was pressing against the edges of her awareness. Her guards screamed, and several of them fell to their knees as an then overwhelming sense of cosmic insignificance washed over everyone in the bay. Something was coming. Something so immense and so ancient that mortal minds could barely perceive it. Without breaking, the shadows themselves began to twist and writhe, pulling away from the walls and floor and ceiling to gather in a single point behind Elias, and then the umbral maw manifested. It was not a creature in any sense that Viral understood, but rather an absence. A hole in reality shaped vaguely like an enormous cat made of pure darkness, and starless void eyes opened in its depths. Dozens of them, each one like a dying galaxy spinning slowly toward oblivion. And when it looked at Viral, she felt her sanity straining at the edges. This was the entity that had devoured entire colonies, that had swallowed moons and stars, that existed in the spaces between dimensions, where physics itself was just a suggestion. This was the end of all things. The hunger that could never be satisfied, the darkness that would one day consume the universe itself. And Elias Ward walked up to it and rubbed its head like it was a house cat. "Hey there, Void Baby," he said in a cheerful voice. "Did you miss me while I was getting dressed for the meeting?" The umbral maw, the most terrifying entity ever recorded in galactic history, made it sound like a pleased kitten impressed. Its impossible form against the human's hands. "I found this one about 5 years ago, drifting through an asteroid field all alone," Elias said as he scratched behind what might have been ears on the creature's shadowy form. She was just a baby then, barely bigger than a transport ship. He smiled at the memory with genuine warmth. Something had happened to her family. I never found out what. And she was scared and hungry and did not know how to survive on her own. The entity that had consumed civilizations curled around Elias like a cat seeking warmth, and its many eyes closed in contentment. I started leaving out quantum fluctuations and exotic matter for her to eat. Just small offerings at first to show I meant no harm. He laughed softly and patted the creature's flank. After a few months, she started following my ship around like a stray dog hoping for food. And eventually, she worked up the courage to come close enough for me to touch her. Viral's guards had stopped screaming and were now staring at the scene in front of them with expressions of complete disbelief. "The umbral maw is not evil," Elias said firmly. "She is just a predator from a very different kind of environment, doing what predators do to survive." He looked at Viral with those tired, kind eyes. Every species in the galaxy looked at these three and saw monsters to be feared and destroyed. But do you know what humans saw when we looked at them? Viral shook her head slowly. "Unable to speak, we saw lonely animals," Elias said simply. "Misunderstood creatures who were lashing out because they were scared and hurt, and no one had ever tried to help them." He stood there surrounded by the three most dangerous beings in the universe, and all three of them looked at him with obvious love and trust. "Humans have a saying back on Earth," he continued. "There is no such thing as a bad dog, just bad owners." He smiled, and the creatures around him seemed to smile too in their own alien ways. Maybe it is time the galaxy learned to see these three the way we do. A long silence filled the docking bay as Viral struggled to process everything she had just witnessed and heard. Entire understanding of the universe had been shattered in the span of a few minutes, and the pieces were refusing to fit back together in any way that made sense. She was a diplomat and a scholar who had dedicated her life to understanding alien cultures and finding common ground between species that seemed to have nothing in common. But nothing in her training or experience had prepared her for a human casually petting an umbral maw while a vexery dozed at his feet and a crethel draped across his shoulders like a living scarf. How? She finally managed to whisper, her voice cracking with emotion she could not hide. How is any of this possible? Elias looked at her with understanding in his tired eyes and gestured toward a stack of cargo crates nearby. Why don't we sit down and talk about this properly? He suggested in a gentle voice. I think you could use a moment to catch your breath. Viral nodded numbly and walked toward the crates on legs that felt like they were made of rubber. And she sat down heavily while trying to remember how to breathe normally. Her guards had recovered enough to stand upright again, but none of them had picked up their weapons, and all of them were staring at the three creatures with mixtures of terror and fascination. Elias sat down across from Viral, and his three companions arranged themselves around him in a protective circle. Midnight. The vexery lay down with her massive head resting on her paws, her glowing patterns pulsing slowly like a heartbeat axiom. The crethel coiled himself into a comfortable spiral and closed his ancient eyes, apparently deciding that the meeting was boring enough for a nap and void. Baby, the umbral maw hovered at Elias's shoulder like a shadow with too many eyes, watching everything with calm curiosity. I understand that this is a lot to take in, Elias said kindly, and I want you to know that I did not arrange this meeting to frighten you or to make some kind of political statement. He leaned forward, with his elbows on his knees and his hands clasped together. I just wanted you to meet my family before we started talking about treaties and conditions and all that diplomatic stuff. Family. Viral thought with wonder. He called these three apocalyptic entities his family. You asked how this is possible. Elias continued, and the answer is actually pretty simple when you think about it. He smiled and reached over to scratch behind Midnight's ears, and the Shadow Wolf's tail thumped against the floor with happiness. Humans come from a death world called Earth, a planet where almost everything is constantly trying to kill us in creative and horrible ways. Viral nodded because she had read the reports about Earth and its endless parade of natural disasters and venomous creatures and hostile environments. But here is the thing that most species do not understand about humans. Elias said with a knowing look, we did not survive by being the strongest or the fastest or the most intelligent. He gestured around at his three companions. We survived because we figured out how to make friends. Viral blinked in confusion because that seemed far too simple to explain anything. Thousands of years ago on Earth, Elias explained, there was a creature called the wolf, a pack predator with sharp teeth and powerful jaws that hunted the same prey that early humans needed to survive. He smiled at Midnight, and the vexery's ears perked up, as if she knew he was talking about her distant evolutionary cousins. By all logic, humans and wolves should have been enemies competing for the same resources. And for a while we were. He shrugged with the casual ease of someone who had told this story many times before. But somewhere along the line, some crazy human looked at a wolf and thought, hey, what if we worked together instead of fighting? Axiom made a sound that might have been a sleepy laugh, and Elias grinned. That human probably got bitten a lot, and everyone else probably thought they were insane. But eventually, they figured out how to communicate with the wolves and earn their trust. He held up his hands as if presenting a great revelation. And that is how we got dogs. Loyal companions who have stood by humanity's side for tens of thousands of years. Viral was starting to understand where this story was going, but she still could not quite believe it. Humans did the same thing with horses and cattle and cats and birds and 100 other species. Elias continued, "We looked at creatures that could hurt us, and instead of destroying them, we tried to befriend them." He laughed softly and shook his head. "Sometimes it worked and sometimes it did not. But the important thing is that we kept trying, because that is just how humans are wired." He looked at Viral with absolute sincerity in his expression. When humanity reached the stars and learned about the extinction-class organisms, we did not see unstoppable monsters that needed to be avoided at all costs. He gestured at his 3 companions with obvious affection. "We saw really big dogs that no one had tried to pet yet." Viral let out a sound that was half laugh and half sob, because the absurdity of it all was finally catching up with her. "You cannot be serious," she said weakly. "You cannot honestly be telling me that humanity tamed the 3 most dangerous creatures in the galaxy by treating them like pets." Elias shook his head firmly and held up a finger to correct her. "Not pets," he said clearly. "Family." He reached out and stroked Void Baby's shadowy form, and the cosmic entity purred with contentment. "There is an important difference between a pet and a family member," he explained. "A pet is something you own and control and train too. Obey your commands." His expression became serious and his voice took on weight. "A family member is someone you love unconditionally. Someone you care for and protect and support, even when things are difficult. Someone you treat as an equal partner in your life." He looked at each of his 3 companions in turn with obvious love. "I did not tame Midnight or Axiom or Void Baby. I befriended them. I earned their trust by showing them kindness when everyone else showed them only violence and fear." Midnight raised her head and pressed her nose against Elias's hand, and the humans smiled at her with genuine warmth. "The Concordat spent millennia trying to destroy these creatures or run away from them," Elias said, "and that is exactly why the problem never went away." He fixed Viral with an intense stare that made her feel like a child being lectured by a wise teacher. Fear breeds more fear. Violence breeds more violence. And as long as everyone kept attacking these creatures, they kept fighting back to defend themselves. He spread his hands in a gesture of simplicity. All it took to break that cycle was one person crazy enough to try something different. Viral sat in silence for a long moment as she turned these ideas over in her mind. Everything she had been taught about the extinction-class organisms emphasized their danger and hostility, their fundamental incompatibility with civilized life. But here was living proof that all of those assumptions were wrong, that these supposedly unstoppable monsters could be gentle and loving when treated with kindness. "The Concordat Council will never believe this," she said finally. "They will think it is some kind of trick or illusion." Elias smiled, and there was something almost mischievous in his expression. "Then I guess we will just have to show them in person." Viral felt a chill run down her spine as Boy. She realized what he was suggesting. "You want to bring these 3 to the Concordat homeworld," she said slowly. "You want to walk into the seat of galactic government with an umbral maw floating behind you." Elias grinned like a man who had been waiting his whole life for this moment. "I think it is time the galaxy met the real Midnight and Axiom and Void Baby," he said. "And I think it is time they learned what humanity can teach them about making friends." Viral looked at this strange human and his 3 impossible companions, and she felt something she had not felt in decades. Hope. 6 months had passed since that fateful meeting on Waystation Terminus, and the galaxy would never be the same again. Ambassador Viral Koss stood on the observation deck of the Concordat Grand Council chamber, watching as Commander Elias Ward walked through the massive doors with his 3 companions. Following close behind, the reaction was exactly what she had expected based on her own first encounter with the human and his family. Thousands of delegates from hundreds of species screamed and fled and trampled each other in their desperate attempts to escape. while the council guards drew weapons that would have been completely useless against even one of the creatures present. But Elias just kept walking calmly toward the central podium. And Midnight and Axiom and Void Baby followed him with the relaxed confidence of beings who knew they had nothing to fear the Grand Arbiter, an ancient being who had served the Concordat for over 1,000 years. Actually fainted when Void Baby floated past his throne and accidentally brushed against his ceremonial robes. It took nearly 3 hours to restore order and convince everyone that they were not about to be devoured by cosmic horrors. During that time, Elias sat on the floor of the council chamber playing a game of fetch with Midnight using a ball of compressed dark matter that Void Baby had helpfully created from nothing. By the time the delegates had calmed down enough to take their seats again, most of them had stopped screaming and started staring with a mixture of terror and fascination. Varl smiled to herself as she remembered the report she had sent to the council after her first meeting with Elias. She had written about the humans and their strange ability to befriend anything, about their stubborn kindness and their refusal to give up on creatures that everyone else had abandoned. She had warned the council that humanity was not a species to be managed or restricted or controlled, but rather a species that could change everything the galaxy thought it knew about fear and friendship. Most of the council members had dismissed her report as exaggeration or delusion, but they could not dismiss the evidence standing right in front of them. Here was a human scratching the belly of a Vexery while an umbral maw helped hold the beast's leg up for better access to the itchy spot. Here was proof that the impossible was possible when you were crazy enough to try the negotiations that followed were unlike anything the Concordat had ever experienced before. Humanity did not ask for conditional membership or restricted access or a probationary period like every other new species had accepted throughout history. Instead, Elias presented a simple proposal with a smile on his face, an axiom draped across his shoulders like a living badge of honor. Humanity would join the Concordat as full members with complete rights and privileges, and in exchange, humans would share their knowledge of befriending the unbefriendable with any species willing to learn. The galaxy has spent 10,000 years running from things that scared you, Elias said as he addressed the assembled delegates, and all it got you was 10,000 years of fear. He gestured at his 3 companions who were lounging contentedly around the council chamber. Midnight spent centuries being hunted and attacked until she had no choice but to fight back to survive. The Vexery raised her head and looked at the delegates with those impossible eyes, and many of them flinched away, even though she was doing nothing threatening. Axiom was captured and tortured by scientists who saw him as a resource to be exploited rather than a living being with feelings and needs. The Krethel made a soft sound of acknowledgement and wrapped himself a little tighter around Elias's shoulders, and Void Baby was just a child who lost her family and did not know how to survive on her own in a universe that saw her as nothing but a threat to be eliminated. The umbral maw floated closer to Elias and pressed her shadowy form against his side, and several delegates gasped as they realized the cosmic horror was seeking comfort from a human. None of them wanted to hurt anyone, Elias said firmly. They just wanted to be left alone, and when that was not possible, they wanted to be treated with kindness. He looked around the chamber at all the frightened faces staring back at him. Humans are not smarter than you or stronger than you or more advanced than you in any way that matters, he smiled, and there was warmth and hope in his expression. But we are willing to try things that other species consider insane, and sometimes that stubbornness leads to miracles. He held up his hands as if offering a gift to the assembled delegates. Let us teach you how to see monsters as friends, and maybe together we can build a galaxy where fear is no longer the first response to anything different. The vote was not even close. Humanity was accepted into the Galactic Concordat as full members by an overwhelming majority. And Elias Ward was appointed as the first human ambassador to the outer reaches, with special authority to pursue diplomatic relations with any species willing to talk viral. Watched as he left the council chamber with his family, and she felt a profound sense of change settling over the galaxy like the first light of a new dawn in the months and years that followed. The effects of humanity's arrival rippled outward across the stars. Human diplomats began showing up on worlds that had been at war for millennia, sitting down with ancient enemies and asking impossible questions that no one had ever thought to ask before. What if we just talked? Instead of fighting, what if we tried to understand each other? Instead of assuming the worst, what if we looked for common ground instead of focusing on differences? These questions seemed absurdly naive to species that had spent countless generations locked in bitter conflict. But somehow the humans kept getting results. Wars that had raged for centuries began winding down as exhausted. Combatants realized that maybe there was another way. Alliances formed between species that had never spoken a civil word to each other before human mediators arrived. And slowly, very slowly, the culture of fear that had dominated galactic politics for millennia began to shift toward something else. Earl eventually retired from diplomatic service and wrote a book about her experiences with humanity that became required reading at every academy in the Concordat. The title was simple and direct. In the human style, she had grown to appreciate the species that refused to be afraid. In the final chapter, she described a visit she had made to Earth to see the world that had produced such remarkable beings. She had expected a planet of warriors and survivors, hardened by their brutal environment into tough and uncompromising creatures. Instead, she had found a world where people kept tiny, furry animals in their homes and talked to them like family members. A world where children would approach wild creatures with curiosity instead of fear. A world where the response to meeting something new and strange was usually, "Can I pet it?" rather than "How do I kill it?" She had watched a human child chase a venomous spider with her bare hands just to put it safely outside rather than crushing it. And she had finally understood something important. Humans were not brave because they did not feel fear. They were brave because they felt fear and chose kindness anyway. And that, Viral concluded, was the real reason humanity would change the galaxy, not through strength or technology or cunning, but through the simple, stubborn belief that anything could be befriended if you cared enough to trying. Her final words. She quoted something Elias had told her during their first meeting, words that had stayed with her ever since. "There is no such thing as a bad dog, just bad owners." Maybe, she wrote, it was time for the galaxy to stop being bad owners and start being good friends. The book ended there. But the story of humanity and their impossible friendships was only just beginning.